Well, good evening and welcome. This is another edition of our early church history course. I'm John Butler, an instructor with International Theological Education Ministries, and this is lecture number 12 for the Lord's Seminary in early church history. Let me go ahead and share our screen here so we can go ahead and begin uh, with this. There we go. All right. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the fall of the Western Roman Empire and its effect upon the Western Church, and also about the rise of the Church in the East, in the old Eastern part of the Roman Empire. Um, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the divergent paths of the Western and Eastern churches. It's not merely a story about politics or economics or warfare. It's a story about how God, in his sovereign providence, builds and sustains his church in the midst of seismic cultural and societal changes. For over 4 centuries, the Roman Empire provided the, there we go, provided the framework of order and stability. Roads connected distant cities. You have a common language, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, allow communication across vast distances. And also, you had a unified legal and political system that created a sense of cohesion in the Mediterranean world. So the church grew within this framework, often persecuted in its early centuries, but by God's grace, eventually it was recognized, tolerated, and even embraced by imperial authority. But by the 5th century, cracks in this vast empire had widened into gaping fissures. The Western Empire, weakened by internal corruption, economic decline, external invasions, finally collapsed in the year AD 476, when Romulus Augustulus, the last of the Western emperors, was deposed. In the East, however, the Roman state endured in what we know as the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, which is now Istanbul today, preserving a strong imperial structure and developing a distinctive Christian culture that would endure for nearly 1,000 more years, up until AD 1453. So our goal in this lecture is fourfold. First, we want to understand the causes and the timeline of the fall of the Western Empire, the how and why this mighty structure collapsed. Second, to explore the effect of that collapse on the Western Church and how it adapted to fill the void of political and cultural authority. Third, we want to trace the rise and growth of the Eastern Church, examining its theology, liturgy, and its relationship with the Byzantine state. And fourth, to reflect theologically on how the Lord of history builds his church in every age, even amid the rise and fall of nations. So as we talk through these events, we're going to see how the Lord fulfilled his promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. We're going to see the remarkable resilience and adaptability of the Western church and the chaos that followed the collapse of the Western part of the empire, and the theological richness and stability of the Eastern Church over in the East, in Byzantium. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to be challenged to consider what lessons that this period of church history holds for us today as we live in our own rapidly changing world. So let's discuss the fall of the Western Roman Empire. To understand the fall of the Western part of the empire, we need to step back and consider both the internal weaknesses that eroded the empire from within and the external pressures that battered it from without. No single event caused Rome to collapse. Uh, Instead, you had a convergence of long-term trends and immediate crises that brought an empire that had stood for centuries to its knees. The first would be internal decay, um, an internal weakening of the empire. Economically, Rome was strained. The empire had expanded far beyond the capacity of its administration to manage efficiently. Its tax system was burdensome and inefficient, pressing heavily on the lower classes while the elite often escaped serious taxation. Inflation and currency debasement reduced the value of Roman coinage. For instance, you would have, let's say, a Roman coin that would uh, contain, let's say, 90% silver, and then mixed with other metals, alloys, and it would be stamped and used, and it would be of a particular weight and value. But then later on, the silver content might be reduced to 75%. And so you have that's called a debasing of the coinage. And so it becomes worth less. And what happens is in economics is called Gresham's law, where the good drives out the bad. So all of a sudden, the 90% silver coins disappear. People are hoarding those, they're hanging on to those, and they're not in circulation. So you have a shrinkage a little bit in the money supply as well. And the coins are debased, and so therefore inflation kicks in, and it just becomes harder and harder to deal with the economics of it. A dependence on slave labor further stifled innovation and productivity. Politically, Rome faced a crisis of leadership. The early empire had been marked by a strong centralized authority under emperors like Augustus and Trajan. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, the imperial throne was unstable. You had usurpations and assassinations and power struggles that were common. The empire lacked a consistent, wise, and strong hand to guide it through its challenges. Culturally and morally, the civic virtues that had once bound the Roman people together had eroded. Patriotism and public service gave way to self-interest and luxury and complacency. And so this moral decline weakened the very foundation of Roman society. Uh, the next we want to examine are external pressures. Um, they accelerated the collapse. The 3rd through the 5th centuries were marked by massive movements of peoples across Europe and Asia. Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, they pressed against Rome's borders. Some sought refuge from even greater threats, such as the Huns, who were moving westward out of Central Asia into Europe. Uh, so others sought new lands and opportunities in the weakened empire. So you have these repeated invasions draining Rome's military resources. The once disciplined and effective Roman legions grew weaker, increasingly dependent on mercenaries who had little loyalty to the empire itself. You have two pivotal events that shocked the Roman world. In AD 410, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city of Rome, something that had not happened in 800 years of existence. And again in AD 455, the Vandals sacked the city. And by AD 476, the Western Empire had effectively ceased to exist when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, who was the last emperor of the West. So within this span of about 66 years, we see all of this happening. You also have religious and cultural shifts within the empire that contribute to the demise of the empire. By the early 4th century, under Constantine, Christianity had moved from a persecuted minority faith to the official religion of the empire. Under Theodosius I, Christianity was declared the only legal religion. And this transformation brought about profound cultural changes. Pagan civic religion, which had once unified the Roman world, was displaced. Christianity brought new values and loyalties, which sometimes clashed with the old order. And so the gospel advances during this time, but the shift also contributed to the sense of instability and a redefinition of identity within the empire. So in summary, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not a single catastrophe that brought it about, but as a result of internal corruption, of external invasions, of cultural transformation. And together these forces created a perfect storm that weakened the Western state that it could not withstand. But in God's providence, what looked like the end of the world to many Roman citizens became the seedbed for transformation, a setting in which the Western Church would emerge as the stabilizing force in a fractured world. Let's talk about some of the key figures and events. The fall of the Western Empire was not simply a story of military defeats or political chaos. It was also a deeply human story, shaped by leaders and thinkers and pastors who helped the church interpret and respond to the collapse of a world that they had known for centuries. Two figures stand out above the rest during this period. The first, Augustine of Hippo, that we've talked about before, and Leo I, who was the Bishop of Rome. Augustine of Hippo, who lived from 354 to 430, when the Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome in AD 410, the shock was profound. You see, Rome had not been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years. So the pagans blamed the Christians, and they argued that abandoning the traditional gods of Rome brought the empire to ruin. You have fear and despair spreading throughout the empire. In response, Augustine began writing his monumental work, The City of God. And this book is one of the most influential works in all of Christian theology and history. Augustine reminded believers that Rome was not the eternal city. No earthly kingdom is eternal. All the kingdoms of men, whether it's Babylon or Greece or Rome, are part of what he called the city of man, so societies that are built on human pride and self-love. In contrast, the city of God, composed of those who are redeemed by Christ, whose citizenship is in heaven, that city cannot fall because it's founded on Christ, who reigns forever. And so for the church in that moment, Augustine provides a theological clarity and pastoral comfort. He taught that the collapse of earthly powers, while deeply painful, does not strike at or shake the eternal purposes of God. He wrote, "The city of God is eternal, no enemy shall overthrow it." And so with that perspective, Christians in the West were given the courage to persevere and to reimagine their mission, not as citizens of a fallen empire, but as pilgrims and ambassadors of an unshakable kingdom. Another important individual is Leo I, who was the Bishop of Rome. He lived from about the year 400 to 461. He's later known as Leo the Great. Augustine was shaping Christian thought with his pen. Leo is exercising remarkable pastoral and political leadership in the city of Rome itself. The empire in the West was weak and disorganized, but Leo provides a stabilizing presence for the people of God. In the year AD 452, Attila the Hun advanced toward Rome. Leo personally went out to meet Attila. And through diplomacy, some say it was through sheer dignity and moral authority of his office, Leo persuades Attila to withdraw. Again in AD 455, when Vandals threatened to destroy the city, Leo negotiates to prevent wholesale slaughter and destruction, even though the city was still sacked. Leo also laid important theological and institutional foundations for the growing authority of the papacy. At the Council of Chalcedon in 451, his Tome of Leo, as it's called, his book, provides clear, biblically faithful articulation of Christ as the one person with two natures, fully God and fully man, which the Council affirms as Orthodox doctrine. And so this theological clarity would anchor the Western Church for centuries to come. Leo saw the Bishop of Rome as uniquely called to exercise spiritual oversight over the whole of the Western Church. Now, while later developments would exaggerate papal authority, Leo's leadership during the empire's collapse made the Bishop of Rome the natural figure to whom the fractured West would look for guidance and unity. Beyond individuals, certain events during this period crystallized the sense of crisis happening. We've talked about the sack of Rome by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410. That shattered the myth of Rome's invincibility, and it signaled to all that the empire was vulnerable. The sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455 reinforced that the Western Empire is powerless to defend itself. In 476, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus was a symbolic end. He was a boy emperor. His name, recalling the founder of Rome, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the effective end of the Western Roman Empire. For the church, these events forced new questions. How should the people of God live when the structures and stability they'd always known are collapsing around them? Well, Augustine and Leo, in their own way, provided answers rooted in the sovereignty of God and the unchanging lordship of Christ. So this period of upheaval reveals both the fragility of earthly kingdoms and the enduring strength of Christ's kingdom. Augustine gave the theological vision to see beyond Rome's collapse to God's eternal purposes. Leo embodies the church's emerging role as a stabilizing and guiding authority in the West. And together they help lay the foundations for the Western Church's leadership in a post-imperial world, a leadership that would shape medieval Christendom for centuries to come. Well, let's talk about the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall. The formal end of the empire in AD 476, of the Western Empire, I should say, was less dramatic than many people imagine. The city of Rome didn't vanish off the map, nor did the basic rhythms of daily life across Europe suddenly stop. But over time, the effects of the empire's fall were unmistakable. You begin to see political fragmentation, economic disruption, the emergence of the church as the only unifying and stabilizing institution left in the West. And so, in a sense, there's a saying, nature abhors a vacuum. So when the Roman Empire falls, the church, in a sense, steps up and provides some kind of order and adhesion together. So let's talk about the political fragmentation post-fall. The Western Empire ceased to exist as a coherent political entity when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. You have Germanic kingdoms. These are territories that once formed the Western Empire. You see new barbarian kingdoms emerging. The Visigoths are in Spain and in southern Gaul, southern France. The Ostrogoths are in Italy. The Franks under Clovis in northern Gaul. So think northern France. The Vandals are in North Africa, and each of these groups brought their own language and customs and tribal loyalties. leading to a patchwork of kingdoms that lacked the unity that Rome had once provided them. So this political disunity would shape Europe for centuries to come. In the contrast, when you look at the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the West, their power is centralized. So the West is just basically become a mosaic of competing rulers, no emperor strong enough to command universal loyalty or authority. You also have economic and social disruption, trade networks that had once stretched across the empire have collapsed. Roads fell into disrepair. Piracy and banditry made travel dangerous because you no longer had a Roman government with a navy to sweep the pirates from the Mediterranean Sea. And so that was one of the things that the Pax Romana, about a 200-year period, the Roman peace as it was known, the power of Rome was such that piracy was almost literally eliminated from the Mediterranean Sea. And so you could see how that would be an advantage. Today, we see the piracy taking place off the Horn of Africa or Straits of Malacca or other places as well. And of course, you got the Chinese coming into the Philippines territorial waters and economic area and disrupting things as well. I just regard them as more formalized piracy in that regard. But there has to be that stability in order for trade on a larger scale to take place. Because there used to be importation of grain from North Africa. That's where the granaries of northern Egypt and all the way over into Libya, and especially in what is now Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, you have the grain fields that supply the bread for Rome. And now with the dangerousness of transporting by sea, you begin to see the collapse of many of the trade routes during this time. Urban life in the cities declined. Many cities shrank dramatically as people returned to subsistence farming out in the rural areas. Why? Because you couldn't have the importation of grain and baking of bread and so forth. It became harder for cities to sustain their populations. Education and literacy, which had been more common in the Roman world, became rare outside of ecclesiastical centers. Sometimes this period is referred to as the Dark Ages, though modern historians rightly nuance that term. Darkness is too simplistic a label. Rather, this was a transitional age, a time of reorganization and adaptation, with the churches being the chief bearer of continuity during this time. We see the rise of the church as a stabilizing force. It basically emerges as the only stable institution in the West. The bishops oftentimes are seen as civic leaders. They provide guidance and mediation in disputes and practical care for communities in the absence of effective secular authority. The Latin language of the church provided a unifying thread across diverse and fragmented kingdoms. Even as the spoken languages of the people evolved into early forms of French and Spanish and Italian, the language of worship, scripture, and theology remained Latin. Here's an interesting point. When you look at the robes that the Roman Catholic priests are wearing and all the various pieces of them, it's a reflection back to the old Roman Empire. The Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church during this time was a very conservative organization. And interestingly, when the church in the West came about, the types of robes and so forth that were being worn by the priests were basic common everyday wear, the Roman robes and so forth. And during this time we're talking about now, the church is a conservative institution. The priests are still wearing the old Roman garb. The barbarians who are coming in oftentimes are wearing what we would call trousers today or pants. And that was not a Roman thing. And so the church clung to the old ways and not necessarily to the new fashions and so forth that came in from the barbarians and so forth, even though you see this transformation taking place in the old parts of the old Western Empire. But the church hung on to the old conservative dress that the priests would wear. And we connote that with the Roman Catholic Church. That was just an ordinary wear of a Roman back in the era when the Roman Empire was still around and a thing. Monasteries become centers of learning and worship and agriculture. They preserve both Christian teaching and classical texts that otherwise would have been lost. For many Christians in the West, the fall of Rome initially seemed like the end of the world. But over time, the church redefined its mission in this new landscape. Evangelization efforts expanded with missionaries bringing the gospel to the pagan tribes throughout Europe. The church increasingly views itself not as a partner to empire, but as an independent spiritual authority called to shepherd the nations through chaos and transition. And so this shift prepares the way for the development of medieval Christendom, where the church would play the central role in shaping European identity and law and culture for centuries to come. So the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Western Empire is a period of instability and transformation. Political authority is fragmented, economies are contracting, society becomes more localized and rural. And yet in this period of upheaval, the church shines brightly as that one enduring institution, a spiritual and cultural anchor that provides stability, preserves learning, and lays the groundwork for a new era of mission and growth. Well, let's talk about the Western Church in the post-imperial world. As I mentioned before, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476 creates a power vacuum. Into that vacuum steps the church, not by deliberate ambition to swoop in and to seize power, but out of necessity and providence. And imperial structures are crumbling. The Western Church becomes a stabilizing force, the keeper of learning, and the missionary agent that carries the gospel to new peoples. And so we want to focus on two key developments here. First, the church as a stabilizing force in a fragmented society. And second, the growing papal authority that we see during this era. It reshapes the ecclesiastical and political map of medieval Europe. The church as a stabilizing force, as first thing we'll look at, you have local communities left vulnerable with the collapse of Roman authority and often were directionless. The church, by contrast, provides stability and continuity in leadership. So in many cities, bishops became the default leaders. They mediated disputes between rival factions or barbarian rulers. They organized relief efforts during famine and plague and war. They negotiated peace and ransom during invasions. And so that civic role of the bishops marks a significant shift. They were no longer just spiritual shepherds. They're often the sole voice of reason and stability in an otherwise chaotic political environment. You begin to see monasticism as a cultural and spiritual anchor, and we'll have another lecture entirely about monasticism and its rise, but I want to mention it here. The monasteries blossom in this period, providing a center of devotion and discipline and training. The rule of Saint Benedict from about the year 530 brings order and balance to monastic life, emphasizing prayer, work, and study. Ora et labora, prayer and work. Monasteries became centers of literacy and scholarship. They copied the scriptures and classical texts and thus preserved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. Later on, several centuries later, when trade with the East starts taking place, you begin to see more manuscripts that had made its way into the Islamic world, making its way into the West, including some of the old Greek texts. But here we're mostly looking at these old Latin translations during this time. The monasteries also pioneered agricultural techniques, making the monasteries hubs of economic productivity and stability in their regions. So in an age where the cities begin to shrink and education wanes, monasteries serve as beacons of light, forming men and women devoted to God, learning, and service. You begin to see the evangelization of the barbarian tribes. The church turns outward in missionary zeal. Ulfilas was a missionary to the Goths, translated the scriptures into Gothic language even before Rome fell, planting seeds of faith among the Germanic peoples. Padraic in Ireland carried the gospel to a pagan and tribal society, establishing vibrant Christian communities that would in time send missionaries across Europe. And by the 6th and 7th centuries, missionary monks such as Columba and up in Scotland and Boniface in Germany bring entire regions under the sound of the gospel. So the church understood that while empires fall, the kingdom of Christ endures. And so it labored to bring the light of the gospel to new peoples and lands. Let's talk a little bit about the growth of papal authority during this time. As we see the disintegration of the Western Empire, the Bishop of Rome emerges as the natural focal point of leadership for the Western Church. The claim of the Roman bishop to primacy rests on two pillars. Apostolic foundation, they claim that Rome had been the site of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, giving it an unparalleled symbolic and spiritual authority. And then practical necessity. In the absence of an emperor in the West, the Bishop of Rome becomes the most visible and stable figure of authority during this time. Gregory the Great, stands out for us. He sent Augustine of Canterbury and others to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons in in England, and he lays the foundation of English Christianity. He codifies elements of worship influencing what we now call Gregorian chant. He was one who exercised great pastoral leadership. He wrote extensively, offering guidance on pastoral care, the duties of ministers, and the interpretation of Scripture. He was also a very skilled diplomat. He negotiated with the barbarian rulers, he defended the city of Rome, and ensured that food distribution took place during times of crises. So his papacy kind of marks the beginning of medieval papacy, a period in which the Roman bishop was not merely a spiritual shepherd, but also a key political player in Europe. This era also sees the growth of what we call sacramental theology. As the visible institutional church becomes more central to the life of the believer, so too does its administration of the sacraments. Baptism is the rite of entry into the covenant community. The Eucharist, the Mass, the sacrifice, the Lord's Supper, is the continual nourishment of Christian life. Penance and other practices that would over time develop into the complex sacramental system of the medieval church. We start to see more and more of that taking place to eventually becoming the seven sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. Well, this growing emphasis on the institutional church is later going to lead to excesses and abuses. But in this era, it provides a sense of stability and assurance in a world of uncertainty. So the collapse of the Western Empire doesn't destroy the church. It clarifies its mission. The church became an anchor of stability, a preserver of learning, a missionary agent of the gospel. Let's talk about what's going on in the East, in the eastern part of the empire, and particularly the Eastern Church. The West crumbled under the weight of invasions and economic decline and political fragmentation. The eastern part of the Roman Empire, centered at Constantinople, continues to thrive. The eastern half of the empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, the name of Constantinople will be changed to Byzantium, or Constantinople was the change of Byzantium. It would continue till 1453. We're going to look at the continuity and stability of the Eastern Empire, the theological and liturgical developments of the Eastern Church, and some of the key figures who shaped Eastern Christianity during this period. Constantinople was founded in the year AD 330, and it was deliberately designated as to be a new Rome, and strategically located on the Bosporus Strait. It serves as a bridge between Europe and Asia and as a crossroads for commerce and culture. Geographically, the city is easily defended, surrounded by water on three sides and protected by massive walls. It has economic strength. It becomes the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean. It controls trade routes between East and West. It has cultural prestige. The city combined Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith in a unique and enduring synthesis. Unlike the fragmented West, the East maintained strong centralized administration. It had a professional bureaucracy which managed the imperial affairs with efficiency. It had a disciplined and loyal army protecting the empire's borders. They exercised strategic diplomacy. It allowed the empire to manage relationships with neighboring powers, often playing enemies against each other to preserve stability for them. And so that continuity allows the Eastern Empire to provide a stable environment in which the church could grow, flourish, and develop distinct theological and liturgical traditions. By a defining feature of the Byzantine world was this close union between the church and state. The emperor was seen as God's appointed protector and sometimes even the head of the church in a practical sense, though not with theological authority. This system is often referred to as Caesaropapism, meaning that the Eastern Church enjoyed imperial support and protection, but was also vulnerable to imperial interference in church affairs. And this dynamic would shape the Eastern Church's history for centuries. So basically, the church was seen as a department of the government. And so Caesar or the emperor would be seen as the head of it. So just as, let's say, in a modern government, you'd have a president and you have a Department of Defense and you'd have a Department of Religion. They would both report ultimately to the president's office. And so that political exercise of control and so forth, you still see elements of it here and there. Caesaropapism, you later began to see in Russia and the czars. Czar is just basically a form of Caesar because they thought of themselves as the third Rome. And and so basically the Russian Orthodox Church, in a sense, is very buddy-buddy with the Russian government. In some ways, it's sometimes seen as a department of state itself. Let's talk about the theology and worship in the East. This relative stability of the Byzantine Empire provides the church with the environment needed to develop a rich and deeply theological tradition marked by spiritual depth and liturgical beauty. There's some theological distinctives in the East that didn't work its way into the West. For instance, the first I want to bring up is known as theosis or deification. Salvation not only brings forgiveness of sins, but participation in the divine life of God through union with Christ. Now, yes, we are united with Christ, but amongst the Eastern theologians, this became almost a we are now participatory in the divine life of God and so forth, and pushed it in very mystical ways and so forth. There's a sense of mystery and transcendence. The Eastern Church cultivated a deep sense of awe in worship, emphasizing the incomprehensibility of God and the majesty of divine mysteries. Now, a lot of it too is a copy of the court ritual that would take place in the Byzantine Empire in the imperial court. And a lot of the lavishness and all of the icons and so forth that you see, a lot of that is reflective of what would go on in the Byzantine Empire's civil government, and especially with the emperor. And the East plays a central role in defining Orthodox Christology, as we've seen, particularly the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, of Ephesus and Chalcedon. So we have them to thank mostly for that, because there were some Western bishops at those conferences, at those councils, but by and large, it's mostly Eastern theologians who are at play in this. Liturgy-wise, worship in the East becomes highly liturgical and sacramental. They adopt what's called the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. That becomes kind of the standard order of worship, filled with scripture and prayer and rich theological symbolisms. Icons become central to devotion, seen as windows into heaven, helping the faithful to contemplate Christ, the saints, and the realities of the spiritual world. Music and architecture convey a sense of heaven on earth, fostering a worship experience that engages the senses and the heart. There are also monastic and mystical traditions that thrived in the East with a slightly different character from what you see in the West. Eastern monks often sought hesychia, which is silence or stillness for prayer and contemplation. The desert monks and nuns inspire movements of spiritual discipline and emphasize prayer and fasting and asceticism. And so this contemplative tradition produces a rich body of spiritual writings that continue to influence Orthodox spirituality today. Some of the key figures in the Eastern Church, John Chrysostom, who lives from about 349 to 407. He's a renowned preacher. Chrysostom means golden-mouthed. He's called for moral reform and care for the poor. And his boldness in confronting imperial excesses cost him his position and led to exile, but his sermons and liturgical legacy endured. We mentioned before the Cappadocian Fathers in an earlier lecture, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. They were instrumental in defending the doctrine of the Trinity against Arianism. Their writings clarified the distinction between the persons of the Godhead and the unity of the divine essence. They emphasize both theological precision and pastoral care. They ensure that doctrine serves the life of the church. Another is Maximus the Confessor, from about 580 to 662. He was a key defender of Orthodox Christology against what was known as the Monothelite heresy, which denied Christ's full human will. His courage under persecution and his theological insight reinforce the truth that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man with two natures and two wills, one divine, one human, in one person. So the Eastern Church thrived in that context of a stable and wealthy empire. It had a theology that was deep and nuanced. Its worship reflected a profound sense of the holy as leaders provide doctrinal clarity that continues to shape Christian orthodoxy. So the Western Church is adapting to the crisis and the chaos and the fragmentation. The Eastern Church is preserving and enriching the intellectual, liturgical, and spiritual heritage that still characterizes Eastern Orthodoxy today. So you don't see as great theological developments in the West in speculation because, frankly, if you're having to work very hard just to keep things together and mouths fed and so forth, you don't have the time and energy to go off and reflect on these things in the same way as you would in the East. So let's talk a little bit about these things and how they could affect us today. When we see the fall of the Western Roman Empire and these divergent paths of the Western and Eastern churches, we need to see this more than just a historical event. They are theological lessons written in the pages of history, revealing the hand of God at work in his church and in the nations. And I want us to reflect a little bit on three key truths. First, God's sovereignty in history. The rise and fall of nations is not random. The prophet Daniel reminds us in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. And so the greatness of Rome and Rome's collapse both occur under the sovereign rule of Christ, the King of Kings. What looked like to citizens of the empire like chaos and collapse was, in fact, the outworking of God's purposes for the advance of his kingdom. And so for the Western Church, the fall of Rome opens new doors. The gospel moves beyond imperial boundaries to reach the barbarian tribes and distant lands. For the Eastern Church, the stability of Byzantium provides an environment to refine and articulate the deep theological truths of the faith. So in our own age, when institutions we once trusted show signs of instability, we're called to rest in the same sovereignty. Christ's kingdom cannot be shaken even when earthly powers rise and fall. Second, mission in a changing world. The early medieval church in the West adapted to chaos with missionary zeal and creative leadership. Monks carried the gospel to Ireland, England, and beyond. Bishops learned to shepherd communities in crisis. And over time, what looked like the loss of a great civilization became the soil in which a new Christian culture would grow. In the East, stability allows for deep rooting of theology and worship and spiritual formation. And the careful articulation of the Trinity and Christology during the ecumenical councils has blessed the entire Christian world for centuries. So in times of cultural upheaval, the church's mission doesn't end. It intensifies. Whether in the chaos of the West or the continuity of the East, Christ's command to make disciples of all nations remains unchanged. So, what does that mean for us today? Well, the history of this era calls us to humility and to faithfulness. Humility, because earthly kingdoms and cultures, no matter how powerful, are fragile. The United States, the European Union, ASEAN, China, Philippines, any modern power is no more invincible than Rome was. And faithfulness. In a world that's often and increasingly feeling unstable, the church must be steadfast in proclaiming Christ, discipling believers, and preserving the truth. And also hope, because Christ is building his church. I will build my church. We can labor with confidence that the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. So when we look at the fall of Rome and the rise of Byzantium, they teach us that Christ reigns over history. He directs the course of nations for the good of his church and the glory of his name. So whether in decline or stability, chaos or order, the calling of the church remains the same, to be faithful witnesses to the unchanging gospel of Jesus Christ. All right, well, let's go ahead and move into a time of discussion here. Uh, let's see. So let's talk a little bit about these things. Where are we? Okay, put up the chat window. Okay, our first question is, how did Christians feel, do you think, during Rome's collapse? How would you feel during Rome's collapse, do you think? If you grew up in this environment, it gave you order and structure. It gave you stability. It's what you knew and so forth. So then you begin to see the collapse of law and order around you. You have the invasions coming in. Imagine if you were around during the time of the deposition of Romulus Augustulus and by Odoacer. That would just be mind blowing. That we no longer have an emperor, and symbolically Rome is gone. Now, I don't know how much that affected daily life at the time out in the provinces and so forth, but I'm sure it would just completely um, be unsettling. I think for your daily life, your existence, and so forth. Um, it would turn your world upside down in a sense. But at the same time, I would think it would also drive you to trust Christ more. At least it should, and to realize our stability is not found in men or in human institutions. The powers that be are ordained by God, Romans 13 reminds us. However, um, God is the one who, as we read from Daniel, creates kings and puts them down. Yeah, steadfastness in the faith, advancing in faith. Yeah, we should seize the moment, opportunities for advancement of the gospel as we go. Um, to be able, uh, we're not going to be trusting in our culture. We're not going to be trusting in our the political background that we have and so forth. Uh, it is something uh, that we need to keep on. Pastor Rocky has written. They certainly read or read the book of Revelation, and they must have been thinking God was judging Rome. Yeah, and this city was not God's chosen city. They must have remembered Rome was responsible for the sacking of Jerusalem. Yeah, that could be, that might have crossed their minds as well. You know, Augustine's message there is, look, all these cities of men are doomed to fail. They're going to fall. They're going to rise and fall. But the only enduring kingdom we have is the Civitas Dei, the city of God, that we must look to. Okay. Let's see here. What are some lessons that we can learn from how the Western Church adapted to these new circumstances? Hmm. Hmm. Well, let me put this into a Filipino context. Let's say overnight, uh, all the government out of Manila ceases, just overnight. How would it affect the churches in the Philippines? How would it affect you as a Christian in the Philippines? Or now, and well, once were the Philippines. We'll put it that way. Yeah. Church must remain steadfast in Christ. Okay. Are we going to see missionaries from Mindanao going to Luzon because, got to take the gospel to those poor people up in Luzon that they too might come to know Christ? Is that what's going to happen? Or maybe over in Sulu or the western part of Mindanao? I don't know. We don't know. Yeah, sometimes religious figures to fix what our civil government is lacking. Western governments are being swarmed and invaded by Muslim immigration, so maybe we need a Charlie Kirk, okay? Although he was not uh, technically a religious figure in that sense, he was more seen as a political figure. Um, but it's interesting the bishops, the metropolitan bishops, as they were known, over the city areas, often stepped in. They had the organization, they had the structure within the church to, step in and provide mercy ministry, feeding of people and the hospitals and care of people and so forth, and using their skills uh, for the betterment of all. Now, over time, these became much more solidified, and the church was seen as having more power. So, we saw in the East, we talked about Caesaropapism. In the West, you see where the church assumes its dominance over politics, that unless the church okays it, somebody can't be king or imposes or deposes rulers um, with the support of or with the Pope being in charge of things. And so you have those two extremes that take place over time. Yeah, Charlie was a product of a Christian school. Interestingly, I was discussing last night with my wife. There is a theologian who's charismatic, but has some reform leanings by the name of Wayne Goodrum, and he had recently posted that, reminiscing with his wife about they helped start a Christian school in the northern suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, and in the early 1980s. And in fact, Goodrum had been Grudem had been the I think president of the board for that school for a couple of years at the beginning. Well, in 2005, a fifth grader, 11-year-old boy, makes a profession of faith in uh, in the context of his class and his teacher exhorting students to trust in Christ. And that fifth grader was Charlie Kirk. So you never know what effect you're going to have with the gospel years down, and who is going to be affected in that way. Okay, all right. Any other reflections on this? What's another way the church adapted in the West? Yeah, certainly resort to monasticism and said we can adopt a Puritan spirituality. Yeah, yeah, certainly can do that. Definitely walk in personal holiness before the Lord and to encourage others to do so as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about Augustine's um, city of God. Um, he taught that the city of God is eternal and unshakable. And how does that perspective help you to interpret the rise and fall of nations today? Mm-hmm. The Lord is sovereign in governmental affairs. Okay. All right. What are some other? What about with regards? Yes, every human problem, whether civil, domestic, or societal, is a product of sin. Yeah. Only the gospel is the answer. The rise and fall of nations imply temporal governments, and God's governing power remains. And though nations rise and fall, Christ's kingdom cannot be shaken. Yeah. And who brings about the rise and fall of these nations? It's the Lord. This is all the outworking of the counsel of his will. Who's known the mind of the Lord, and who has been his counselor? You know that these things should come about. And one of the things that Augustine stressed was the sovereignty of God over all of this. And so, how does the truth of God's sovereignty comfort us in times of cultural upheaval? Hmm. Okay, very good. Um, so how does that truth of God's sovereignty comfort us in times of cultural upheaval? Well, the Lord's got this. The Lord is in charge of all this, and And to us, things seem to be in chaos. But we can see beyond that to indeed the Lord controlling all things, working all things together for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And so um, that knowledge of the sovereignty of God gives us stability, gives us patience, also kind of helps keep us from running around like a chicken with its head cut off, just all over the place. Um, we can be sober minded. We can not let these things influence us and drive us to despair or to engage in rash actions, but to rest in Him. Yeah, that's a good comment, Mark. We should have this eagerness to pray for our government. Yes, Christ is on his throne, ruling heaven and earth, and what we've learned is we should labor in confidence and faithfully abide in him. Yes, exactly, exactly. Trust in the Lord and to keep doing what he has called us to do. To love him, to love his people, to serve others, to carry the gospel, to call all men everywhere to faith and repentance in Christ Jesus itself. And so, uh, does the modern church need better balance of missionary urgency and theological depth? Do we need a better balance of these things or not, do you think? Hmm. Let me go ahead and write that out. Um, discuss whether the modern church needs a better balance of missionary urgency and theological depth. I'd say the church needs both in increasing measure. It's not one or the other. We need both. Um, and to take the gospel to the nations. There is that need, that urgency there. Now, sometimes you'll see an urgency um, to take the gospel. We've got to take the gospel to the nations. We don't have time to talk about theological niceties and some of the important points of theology, Christology, of ecclesiology, of soteriology, how we're saved and so forth, get papered over and not really dealt with or the depths of understanding that we need to have in those areas because there's that urgency to take the gospel out. But what gospel are we proclaiming? What Jesus are we telling the people about? Is the true Christ? Is it truly Him? And so I think we need to have an increasing urgency in our missionary work and theological depth in what we're doing. Yeah, missions without theological depth produces Christianesque. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Uh, and good theology should produce good missionary ministries. Exactly. It should, it must. If we've truly grasped it and affected our hearts, that should drive us with that zeal, that desire for the gospel to go forth, for Christ to be honored by all peoples everywhere. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Now, sometimes you have people who are very theologically minded and they love to study it and so forth, but they have no sense of missionary urgency, or they pay lip service to it because they know they need to. But they're not engaged in the work of evangelism, not engaged in the work of the gospel itself. And that's a temptation, to be all one as opposed to the other. Why not both? you know, we to be at this at all times. Okay. Um, the ongoing global mission of the church, especially in regions experiencing political and cultural upheaval. Um, when we look at a region of the world, and let's say there's war going on in a place, or great upheaval uh, going on, we go, oh, wait a minute, we can't really do missions there because things are in. We want things to be nice and stable and so forth before we feel comfortable sending people in with the gospel to those areas. Is that necessarily the right approach, do you think? Kind of wait till things settle down a bit before we send people in, or do we send people in eyes wide open and understanding, hey, this is an unstable situation. But but oftentimes you see in times of instability, those are also great times for the spread of the gospel because people's trust is being taken away from those cultural institutions and religious institutions and governmental structures that they once trusted in for their peace and stability. And and now we're coming in, well, hey, we've got a message of an eternal stability, of an eternal God who never will leave you or forsake you. I think we find in times of instability, people um, can be more receptive to the message of the gospel. Now, ultimately, that's the Holy Spirit's work in opening people's eyes and hearts. But you do find at times um, people are more receptive. So I don't think we should shy away at all. And in fact, we should seize the day to see the opportunity to strike while the iron is hot. Peter and John in Acts experienced heavy opposition. They continued sharing the gospel exactly. All right, Mark, part of a missionary agency before, and this agency has endeavored to look for young people who are passionately to go into cross-cultural mission. Been in Cambodia, the problem, you notice there was no theological training in the missionaries, though passionate, but not theologically inclined and equipped. Yep, yep, exactly, Mark, exactly. And that's the tragedy in some of these situations. Now, there might have also been not the opportunity for men to be more theologically grounded. Okay, that's all part of the providence of God, but we should look for opportunities to help our brothers become more theologically grounded. Um, and that's part of the mission that of ITEM International Theological Education Ministries that I'm involved with is at the request of our brethren around the world to come in and help in training. And we sit down and say, what is it that you think you need? And we tailor our teaching according to those requests to be able to help strengthen the church and to kind of raise the floor, as it were, of their theological understanding and give them better grounding and structure for them. We're not coming in and doing the ministry for them. And eventually, the goal would be that locally they could do this. And so, the Lord's Seminary is one of those ways. Pastor Rocky and others had the vision to help train pastors in that part of Mindanao uh, to be better grounded in the work of the gospel. And so that's that's kind of why we're doing this. That's kind of who we are to help and assist our brothers around the world. And so with the Lord's Seminary, doing that in February, God willing, I'm going to Myanmar and to help brothers there in a Bible college, and then leaving from there and flying to Nepal and meeting with a network of rural pastors and to help raise the floor of their biblical and theological understanding as well. And God willing, at some point to come in person again to the Lord's Seminary and to be able to teach there as well. So this is what we can be doing, to take the gospel out to the nations. Una brings up open air preaching. Yes, opportunities for that, to be able to go where people are. We're not going to get people necessarily coming into the doors of our meetings, of our meeting places, sometimes you will. Times of crisis can bring that about, both personal crisis and larger societal crises. But we need to take the gospel out to the marketplace and to speak to others, as well as the Lord provides opportunity. Well, thank you so much for this evening's time with you. I always look forward to coming and being with you. God willing, next time our lecture number 13 will be on the rise of monasticism, and discuss that in more detail. Well, the Lord bless you, and we will see you, God willing, next week. I'll try to get this uploaded to Dropbox and share the link with you in the messenger group for the Lord's Seminary, and then God willing, Pastor Rocky will later move that the lecture to the YouTube channel itself. Well,
Thank you very much, Mr. John.
all right. Sleep well.
Thank
God
you.
bless.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much, Sir John.